This morning, I want to look at the exact moment a $2.5 billion a day partnership hit a wall. On February 1, 2025, the US-Canada border, the world's largest bilateral trading artery, effectively became a barrier. When Donald Trump announced a flat 25% tariff on all Canadian imports, it wasn't just a policy shift. It was a structural shock to the North American economy. Here is the context of what that meant on the ground. Canada sends roughly $419 billion in goods to the US every year. When you break that down, you're looking at $125 billion in mineral fuels, $51 billion in vehicles, and a massive supply chain for machinery that keeps the American Midwest running. Most critically, Canada provides 62% of all foreign crude imported by the US, about 4.1 million barrels per day. American refineries in states like Illinois and Minnesota were physically built to process this specific heavy crude. They cannot simply flip a switch to a different supplier. That detail tells you why the market reaction was immediate and violent. By slapping these goods with a 25% tariff and a 10% levy on energy specifically, the administration didn't just target a foreign government. It targeted the input costs of its own manufacturing base. Within weeks, Canada responded with $30 billion in surgical retaliatory tariffs. These weren't arbitrary. They targeted products like Florida orange juice, Kentucky bourbon, and Pennsylvania steel. The strategy was clear. By hitting these specific states, Canada was applying direct, localized pressure on the political districts most vital to the administration's support. But the real turning point, the moment that made bond markets move within hours, didn't happen in a warehouse or a factory. It happened on May 6, 2025, inside the Oval Office, after an explosive Truth Social post where the president claimed America needs absolutely nothing that Canada can offer. Newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney,
a man who previously ran both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, sat
across from him. The exchange was brief, but it redefined the entire conflict. When the president suggested the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, Carney delivered a line that froze the room. Some properties in this world simply are not for sale. When the president doubled down, telling him to never say never, Carney looked him in the eye and replied with a single, calm word, never. That was the moment the trade dispute stopped being a negotiation and started looking like economic warfare. The situation we established in Part 1 is clear. The February 2025 tariff shock wasn't a policy pivot, it was an exercise in leverage. With $2.5 billion in daily trade under fire, the US and Canada found themselves locked in a cycle of escalation that threatened to dismantle the most integrated supply chain in the world. As retaliatory measures hit American swing states and the rhetoric reached a boiling point with the Oval Office standoff, the mask of friendly trade fell away, revealing a harsh new reality of 21st century economic statecraft. Perfect daily grind. When we look at the strategic data, it becomes evident that the subsidy narrative pushed by the White House was a calculated political framing. The official trade numbers tell a different story. In 2024, Canada was the single largest export market for American goods, purchasing more than China, Japan, France, and the UK combined. That detail tells you that the US economy isn't a passive victim of a trade drain. It is an active, deeply entangled partner. When President Trump claimed on Truth Social that America netted absolutely nothing from Canada, he was disregarding the reality that 62% of U.S. foreign crude oil arrives via Canadian pipelines. Here's what that means. Every time a tariff hits these energy flows, it isn't just a political tax on a neighbor. It is a direct, measurable price hike for every American driver at the pump. Innova Wealth Partners Show 1. The economic data released by the C.D. Howe Institute in February 2025 provided the tactical blueprint for Canada's response. By identifying that the U.S. maintained a $50 billion annual windfall from energy trade alone, Ottawa realized they held structural cards that could not be easily replaced. Prime Minister Mark Carney's strategy was to shift the conversation from concession to interdependence. In his address at the World Economic Forum, Carney argued, "Deep trade ties between democracies are not a luxury. They are a form of collective security." This statement was a masterclass in strategic framing by labeling the supply chain as security infrastructure. He shifted the burden of proof onto the White House, forcing them to explain why they were actively degrading their own national stability. The effectiveness of this strategy was confirmed by the bond markets. Within 48 hours of the high-stakes Oval Office meeting, the 10-year Canadian government bond yield tightened by 12 basis points. This move was a clear signal from institutional investors. They saw that Carney was not just reacting, he was managing a long-term fiscal defense. As one analyst at the time noted, Carney isn't playing for the next news cycle. He's playing for the next decade. This level of discipline forced the White House to face the midterm reality. Internal memos leaked in late showed senior advisors were alarmed by the pressure from Republican governors in the Midwest. States leak, Iowa and Ohio that rely heavily on the $419 billion in annual export demand by mid-June. The structural costs of the tariff war were laid bare. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that American consumers had already absorbed $200 in additional annual costs per household. This wasn't just an abstract statistic. It was a visible drag on the U.S. fiscal position. Every basis point increase in borrowing costs, driven by geopolitical isolation, represented roughly $2.5 billion in additional annual debt service for the U.S. government. Canada's choice to remain calm, methodical, and data-driven made the White House's aggression look increasingly like a self-inflicted wound. Even as a temporary 90-day pause was negotiated for auto parts in June, the core tension remains unresolved. The fundamental question hanging over the entire continent is not whether the tariffs will be lifted, but whether the very concept of a trusted partner can be rebuilt after such a profound betrayal of the North American economic model. We are left with one critical unresolved question. Will this 90-day window be used to restore the architecture of the trade relationship? Or is this simply a strategic pause before the next, and potentially final, round of economic warfare begins? The standoff described in our previous segments was never a simple dispute over balance sheets. It was a structural stress test for the entire North American order. By moving from initial shock, the 25% tariff announcement in February 2025, to the surgical retaliation of the spring and the tense, data-driven diplomacy of early summer, the two nations have effectively dismantled the illusion that their economic integration is politically immune. This is what economic warfare looks like in the 21st century, a persistent grinding conflict where the traditional tools of statecraft, quotas, duties, and rhetoric, are deployed not just to balance trade, but to signal geopolitical realignment. For the United States, this era marks a painful transition. The data shows that the domestic cost of decoupling from Canada has been systemic. American manufacturing, especially in the Midwest, has been forced to absorb billions in additional costs while facing the potential for long-term supply chain fragmentation. The strategic shift here is a move away from the trusted partnership model toward a more volatile, transaction-based defense policy. The likely next moves from Washington involve further testing the resilience of these chains, likely through a mix of targeted domestic subsidies and continued pressure on CUSMA-compliant goods. As the political need to bring production home continues to outweigh the immediate fiscal reality of higher consumer prices, for Canada, the outcome is a transformation of its national security and economic identity. Under Mark Carney's leadership, the strategy of cooperative resilience has not only secured temporary relief, but has also forced Ottawa to pivot toward broader international alliances. By successfully integrating into European defense frameworks and seeking new trade pathways with Asian markets, Canada is hedging against American volatility. The next moves for Ottawa will be defined by institutionalizing this diversification, locking in these non-North American trade routes to ensure that the leverage Washington once held over its energy and resource sectors is permanently diminished. Internationally, this dispute has served as a wake-up call for Europe and the G7. The insight here is that the US-Canada rift has created a power vacuum that other global actors are moving to fill. The lesson is not that globalism has failed, but that the security of supply chains is now the most critical frontier of foreign policy. The single most important takeaway is this: In a world where economic interdependence is weaponized for domestic political leverage, the only truly stable asset is a diversified portfolio of alliances. The era of assuming that North American integration is permanent has ended, replaced by an era where every supply chain is a strategic asset to be defended, and every trade agreement is subject to the cold, hard calculus of national security. When political volatility meets structural economic reliance, the status quo is never the destination. It is merely the first thing to be discarded.